interesting than mine, I'm sure. So I'm sorry if I'm going to be reading it. It is actually Helen's great pleasure to introduce my former lab mate, Dr. Sam Bashevkin, as our BML seminar series speaker today. Sam is a former BMLer and completed his ecology degree at Davis in 2019. While working at BML, Sam's research focused on the evolutionary ecology of marine and aquatic organisms and the relationships among life history stages, physiology, and morphology. In particular, his research focused on understanding how marine larvae, especially tiny baby crabbies, defend themselves against threats they face in the plankton. Imagine Helen saying this rather than me. After completing his degree, Sam worked as a senior environmental scientist at the Delta Stewardship Council for 2 years before he moved to his present position as environmental program manager at the State Water Resources Control Board. In addition to being a program manager, Sam continues to conduct cutting-edge research to understand zooplankton responses to environmental change and has published on plankton distributions and temperature change in the San Francisco estuary. Leveraging old monitoring programs for new insights into San Francisco estuary temperature trends. So that's the introduction to Sam. Welcome, Sam. Good to have you back here. And feel free to introduce yourself further if you like, correct anything Helen said that's inappropriate. And yeah, take it away.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, John and Helen. Thanks everyone for having me. It's great to be back here. I did make a tiny change in the title. I removed the word temperature so I could talk a little bit about zooplankton, which is fun to add a little bit of biology into this. So anyway, yeah, as Helen said, Sam Bashevkin. I currently work at the State Water Board, but most of the work I'm talking about I did while I was at the Delta Science Program, which is a part of the Delta Stewardship Council, a different California state agency. And just want to be clear, everything I say is my personal opinion, may not represent the views of the State Water. Yeah, so as many of you probably know, we're in an era of big ecological data. There's been an exponential increase in data collection and availability, a rise of open science and data sharing, and advanced open source analytical toolkits. And in conjunction with that, there's been a rise in long-term monitoring, which has produced a lot of this data that we can use. And long-term monitoring is really important for advancing both ecological science as well as environmental management. And the roots of a lot of long-term monitoring programs can be traced to the National Environmental Policy Act that was passed in 1969, which is coincidentally within a few years of when some of our longest running monitoring programs started in the San Francisco estuary. So the San Francisco estuary, if you're not too familiar with it, it's pictured on this map that you see. It's composed of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is the green portion, which is the confluence of the Sacramento River from the north and the San Joaquin River from the south, as well as a few side tributaries. They come together right before Suisun Bay, and then it leads into San Francisco. And I roughly kind of tried to figure out where we are. I think it's about that yellow dot in the black space there. And a lot of the monitoring, especially in the upper part of the estuary and Suisun and the Delta, is conducted by the Interagency Ecological Program, which is a consortium of 6 federal and 3 state agencies. And they inform management of the San Francisco estuary. They operate critical long-term ecological monitoring surveys, and they serve as a collaborative venue for science in the area. And there are many open scientific questions in the estuary along the applied to basic continuum that could be addressed with this rich monitoring data. And many have in the past. There's about 20 to 40 papers published per year using these data. There's just a few examples, and they range from basic ecological questions up to more applied local management questions. So in this talk, I'm going to just walk through 3 illustrations of how I've used long-term monitoring data to answer scientific questions in the estuary, and they'll range from the more applied to the more basic. So first, I'll talk about how water temperatures have changed over the past 50 years. Then I'll talk about the relationship between water temperature and inflow. And lastly, some abundance trends of zooplankton. So to start out with the temperature trends, this was a project in collaboration with Brian Maharja at the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and Larry Brown at the USGS. And water temperature is, of course, a really important variable. It's important for metabolism, predation, thermal stress, development rates, reproductive timing, and of course, it's changing with climate change. And we can look backwards to try to inform the future and how we might manage temperature into the future. So understanding past trends can help us prepare for the future. And there have been a few studies in temperatures in this region. One study found a warming rate of 0.007 degrees Celsius per year at a location called Mallard Island, which is right at the confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers over about a 25-year period from 1985 to 2001. But 3 other studies have detected no warming trends in the upper estuary. And for robust analysis of water temperature trends, we really need a long time series and a good spatial resolution. And the spatial resolution is important to help us understand temperature trends in the regions most important to the key species in the system, as well as identify areas of potential refugia. So in this study, we had 3 questions. First, how have water temperatures changed over the past 50 years? How have these trends differed spatially and seasonally? And have temperature trends themselves changed over time? So is the trend linear, or have there been deviations in the trend itself? The approach that we used was to first integrate water quality data from long-term discrete monitoring surveys, develop spatially explicit models of water temperature trends, and evaluate the spatial and seasonal differences in those trends. The data set that we used was about 60,000 temperature records from 1969 to 2020 from almost 400 locations and 9 different surveys. All the sampling points are pictured in the map to the right. They're mostly boat-based, either water quality or fish monitoring surveys. And of course, when you collect fish, you also collect temperature data. That's where we got it from. The model that we used was a generalized additive model, or a GAM, that would be our package MGCV. GAMs are used to model nonlinear patterns, and they use smooths, which are nonlinear relationships without any assumed curve shape, such as you might find in a quadratic, where quadratic equations assume a particular shape of unimodal relationship, but GAMs make no such assumptions, so it can fit any sort of nonlinear shape. And our response variable was water temperature, and then this is a generalized depiction of the model formula, and I'll just walk through each component. So first we had a background spatial seasonal smoother that was a smooth of latitude, longitude, and Julian day or day of year. And this just let us capture kind of the background temperature signal, on top of which we would then assess the trend over years. That was the next component, which was the long-term temperature trend. It's again a smooth of latitude, longitude, and Julian day, but now multiplied by year. So this is estimating a slope that can vary spatially and seasonally. And next, we just had a time of day correction, since the samples were collected at various times of day. We used a scaled T model family for heavy-tailed data and an AR1 process for temporal autocorrelation. And the focus of the study was on the temperature trend over time, which is surrounded in the yellow box right now. So we extracted that model term, which you can think of as a slope smoothed over geography and season. So it's a geographically and seasonally varying slope. And we plotted this to evaluate the spatial and seasonal variability in the temperature. So the main result that we found is a warming rate of 0.017 degrees Celsius per year over the past 50 years. The graph that you see has separate subplots for each month. Each plot is a map of the study region, with red areas indicating a warming trend and gray areas indicating no significant warming trend. And the darker the red color, the higher the warming trend. I'm going to walk through some of the main findings. So first of all, interestingly, we found there was no trend in October over the 50 years. In March, July, and August, there was no trend in most of the estuary. We found the fastest warming in the northernmost regions, where the Sacramento River enters the delta. The slowest warming in the central regions, right at the confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. And the warming was most widespread in November through February, as well as April. Next, as I said before, we want to see how the temperature trend itself has changed over time. To do this, we created 6 25-year sliding window time series. So we basically subdivided the time series into 25-year periods, and then fit the same model structure on each of those periods separately to see what the trend would be. So now this plot still has separate plots for each month, but now time period is on the x-axis and the temperature trend on the y-axis, and the color represents the proportion of grid cells in the study region with a significant temperature trend. This is complex, but I'll just draw out 2 of the main findings that we found. First of all, the trends were varied, but warming was most common. You'll see there are cooling periods, there are warming periods, but most of the points are above the horizontal line at 0. And lastly, interestingly, the most recent 25-year period, 1995 to 2020, had the most consistent warming trend. 10 out of 12 months had a. You might be wondering how 0.017 degrees Celsius per year compares to other studies in this system or in others. I'm going to walk through a few, and as I talk through them, the points will appear on the graph on the right. So it is similar to past studies and other estuaries. So air temperatures in this region have increased by about 0.009 to 0.016 degrees per year. The study I referenced earlier in Mallard Island, which is right in our confluence region, increased by 0.007 degrees Celsius per year. And in that same geographic region, we found a warming rate of 0.11 degrees per year. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that that area had the lowest warming rate. Moving into other estuaries in the Hudson River, a study found that it warmed by 0.015 degrees per year. The Chesapeake, 0.021 to 0.04 degrees per year. And Narragansett Bay by 0.027 to 0.032 degrees per year. So our estimate is well within other estimates in this estuary, as well as in other estuaries, which seem to be warming perhaps a little faster. So then we want to look at what the implications might be for habitat restoration. To do this, we looked at 6 priority habitat restoration areas identified in the region in the Delta Plan, and we extracted the temperature trends for each of these regions separately. That you'll see in the graph on the right. So in this graph, now we have month on the y-axis. The x-axis shows the temperature change per year. The point color is the proportion significant, and each plot represents a different region. Match those on the graph or on the map on the left. So first, we found the fastest warming in the Cache Slough area, which, if you might remember, I mentioned that the northernmost region had the highest warming rate, so that's not surprising. The slowest in the western delta, again, that's near the confluence. Data were limited in the San Joaquin floodplain and Cosumnes-Mokelumne regions. Not as much long-term monitoring data in those areas, but it does seem to be a gap. Most of the Yolo bypass was excluded from the study since it's a floodplain that's not always inundated, so we couldn't really assess water temperature trends in an area that doesn't really. And of course, it's important to realize that the channel temperatures might not necessarily represent the temperatures in a restored wetland, but it could be a good indication of what the temperature trend might be in those regions. So what does this all mean? First, the rising winter and spring temperatures in the northernmost region may threaten anadromous fishes. That is a key migration corridor into the Sacramento River. And warmer temperatures have been found to lead to smaller outmigrating salmon, and smaller outmigrating salmon have lower survival when they reach the ocean. Spring warming could also shift or shorten fish spawning windows, some of which are temperature dependent, such as for delta smelt and endangered species in the estuary. And the central regions near the confluence that are warming more slowly may serve as refugia or may be an area of interest for habitat restoration if temperature is good. So I've been talking about just general trends in temperature, but you might be wondering about extreme events. What about heat waves? And that's something we've just started doing in a new project that I'm co-leading with Brian Maharja. We have a few other collaborators, Kat Pien from Reclamation, Rupa Basu and Darshani Pearson from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, Brittany Davis from the Department of Water Resources, and Shruti Khanna from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And for this, we're looking at heat wave frequency, intensity, and duration for both air temperatures, which have implications for people and for terrestrial wildlife, and for water temperatures, which have implications for aquatic wildlife. And we're doing this in the regions depicted in the map to the right, where the shaded regions represent areas of interest for people. They're either large cities or small towns like Isleton, where we're assessing air temperature trends. And then the points represent areas where we're assessing water temperature trends. I'm just going to show a preview of some of those results. So we did find that heat wave frequency has increased over the past 20 years. We defined a heat wave as 3 consecutive days over the monthly 90% quantile temperature. And this was significant for air temperatures, but not for water temperatures, although you can see the trend. So the leftmost panel of figures is air temperature, right is water temperature. The top row represents the trend over years, whereas the bottom row shows seasonal trends by month. So in the top panel, you can see increasing trends over time for both air temperature and water temperature, although it wasn't significant for water temperature. It's also interesting to note, since we did use the monthly 90% quantile to define heat waves, we're able to detect winter heat waves and actually found the highest frequency of heat waves in the winter, which thing and not necessarily what we expected, definitely not what people pay attention to. But this is an ongoing project. We're just starting it. So the next steps, of course, every study opens up more questions. It'd be interesting to know why there's this spatial and seasonal variability in warming. Ideas, but it's not entirely clear, and one way to start would be to see whether air temperatures show the same pattern. It'd be interesting to know how warming temperatures have impacted habitat suitability for species in the estuary, many of which are temperature limited. And lastly, what tools we have to control water temperature. So what can we do about this? And that kind of leads us nicely into the next study. So the next one, we were looking at how water temperature and inflow were related in the estuary. This again was in collaboration with Brian Maharja. So we already talked about temperature, but inflow is also a critically important variable in this estuary. Inflow determines salinity. It's controlled by water supply. The estuary is a huge water supply hub for the entire state of California. It's affected by floods and droughts, and it's altered seasonally by infrastructure. Almost all of the water has to pass through a dam before it can reach the estuary. And inflow and water temperature are related through a complex causal web. It's not like there's a clear relationship just between one and the other. There's a lot of other variables that are important. I'll just walk through it. So, of course, at the top we have climate change, which can affect weather and the air temperatures in the region. Then we have snowmelt and precipitation, water management. And then there's inflow, the temperatures upstream of the delta, and then the water temperatures of the delta itself. It's just really important to keep this in mind, that the study that I'm going to talk about, we looked at correlations. We didn't assess causation, and hopefully this web shows why it's not so simple to apply causation based on a correlation. I'll talk about that more a little later too. But how are temperature and inflow correlated? There are some seemingly contrasting statements in the literature about this. Some papers have said that reservoir released inflow has little influence on delta water temperatures. but a few studies have also found negative temperature inflow correlations in some regions and seasons. So they're kind of be in conflict with one another, and that's why I wanted to look into this more. And of course, we leverage long-term monitoring data for resolution to this. So we wanted to know how water temperature and inflow are related in the upper estuary. How does this differ seasonally, spatially, along the salinity gradient, and including long-term temperature trends? And to what extent could in-delta precipitation be driving? So we use the same data set as the prior study, and you'll notice it's a very similar model structure as well, with just one key change. So again, we had this background temperature pattern. But now, instead of having a temperature trend over time, we had the temperature inflow relationship, which again was a smooth of latitude, longitude, and Julian day, but now it's multiplied by the 30-day lagged mean inflow, so the mean inflow over the prior 30 days before each temperature record. And that's instead of in the prior model where we had year in place of that. Again, the time of day correction, the scale T family, AR1 process. And as before, we're focused on this temperature inflow relationship surrounded by the yellow box. Again, it's like a slope smoothed over geography and season, but in this case, the effect of inflow rather than the trend over time. What we found was a predominantly negative temperature inflow relationship. This graph should look similar to what I showed before, but now the colors represent the temperature change per change in inflow, or the temperature inflow correlation. So these negative temperature inflow relationships are indicated with blue. This is where higher inflow is found with cooler water. This is kind of what you would usually expect from one of these relationships, especially river system. And it was the most common that we found. There's mostly blue in this graph. But we also found some cases of positive temperature inflow relationships where higher inflow is found with warmer water. And this seems to occur during the winter and in some downstream areas during the summer. But what if we look just at in-delta precipitation? So we fit the same model, but subbed in precipitation for inflow, and this is just precipitation within the delta, not throughout the whole watershed. And we found similar results as the prior graph, but it's muted in the summer-fall when precipitation is negligible. This is probably what you'd expect. If you've been in California, you know there's not very much precipitation in the summer and fall, so it's hard to correlate anything with something. Yeah, but otherwise the results were pretty similar to what we found. Next, we want to know whether incorporating the long-term temperature trend in the model might change the result. So with the prior study I showed, we showed that temperature has been increasing over time. You might wonder if that could influence this temperature inflow relationship, and if itself has also been changing over time. So we fit the same model, but now we just added back in the component from the prior study, the temperature trend over time. And no, it's basically the exact same result. Then we wanted to substitute salinity for geographies and Sinestrian systems. Many processes operate more along the salinity gradient than along the geographic space. So we just, instead of having latitude and longitude in the model, we just subbed in salinity instead. This graph, again, we have different panels for each month. Now the x-axis is salinity, and the y-axis is the temperature change per change in inflow, or the temperature inflow relationship. And we found a couple interesting findings. First, in February through July, there seemed to be an abrupt change in the temperature inflow relationship at a salinity of about 1.5. Oh, and I forgot to mention the vertical dotted red line represents the salinity at the confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. So that's just to help anchor this graph to the geography, since the salinity field moves seasonally. So there is. And the other finding was that the temperature inflow relationship is often lower at lower salinities. So, and that would be closer to the river inputs where the freshest. So you know this, the graph often starts off with the lower, and then it goes up a little bit. Interesting when I'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm just going to talk through, some possible explanations for this separately for the dry and the wet season, since the results differed by those seasons. So first, in the dry season, we, as I said, we found reduced or non-existent temperature precipitation relationships compared to the wet season, again, since there's not much precipitation. Because of that, the temperature inflow relationship was much stronger than the temperature precipitation relationship. This might imply that external influences like river temperature or flow could be driving the temperature inflow relationship in this season. This is bolstered by the stronger, more negative temperature inflow relationships that we found near the river inputs, like I just showed you in the prior salinity graph, where the fresher salinity had more negative temperature inflow relationships. And that would be expected if flow is a big influence. You'd expect that influence to be greatest for the but what we don't know is whether this is because inflowing waters are cooler in this season or because of decreased residence time with higher flows, which could be another contribution. Lower residence time means the water moves faster through the system and has less time. Now for the wet season, we found consistent temperature inflow and temperature precipitation relationships. This might suggest that precipitation or its correlates could be driving the temperature inflow relationship. The positive temperature inflow relationships in the winter could be the result of warmer air temperatures that accompany atmospheric rivers. So notice generally when we have these atmospheric river events, at least near Sacramento, the air temperatures increase when they hit. And of course, precipitation also comes with those events, so they would be causing higher inflow through the precipitation and higher air temperatures, which then influence flow. But one interesting thing we found is that the temperature inflow relationship switches to being negative in March. Not entirely sure why that is. One possible explanation is a greater influence of cloud cover as the days get longer and the sun is out for more time. Or it could be influence of snowmelt, which is mostly in March and April. Now I just want to come back to this causation issue. So again, the study looked at correlation, not causation, and it did not evaluate the impact of dam releases on water temperature. I'm going to just walk through an example to show why we can't assume that, since it'd be easy to just assume that's a causal driver behind this, and that has various implications. But on the screen now, you can see a simplified version of the causal web I showed earlier. And we found, as I said, predominantly negative temperature inflow relationships, but there are a couple possible mechanisms that could result in this observation. So I'm just going to walk through two scenarios. The first one is one in which water management could control temperatures in the delta. In this scenario, we have greater water releases leading to higher inflows, lower upstream river temperatures, and thus lower delta water temperatures. So this is what you'd expect if reservoir releases have a causal effect on delta water temperatures. Now, an alternative scenario is one in which hot droughts separately drive inflow and water temperature without a causal link between those two variables. The hot droughts are something that are becoming more common. It's where hot air temperatures lead to lower inflow because of evaporative water loss. So in this case, the weather, the hot air temperatures would separately drive lower inflow because of increased evaporation and lower water supply. But they'd also cause, of course, the higher air temperatures, and air temperature is tightly linked to water temperature. So here, so this would result in the same negative temperature inflow relationship. We have inflow going down, temperature going up, without any causal link between the two variables. I mean, I would guess it's probably some combination of those two. I think there's definitely some causal influence of inflow on water temperature, but the degree to which inflow influences water temperature is not really known or quantified at a causal basis. That's something that would be really good to look at in the future. So the implications of this, since we did find relationships between inflow and water temperature, and we do expect increased precipitation variability with climate change, this may also lead to increased variability in delta water temperatures. It might also imply that water temperatures could be a hidden stressor during droughts. The magnitude of temperature change that we detected with changes in inflow could alter the spawning window of delta smelt or reduce the rearing time of juvenile Chinook salmon. This could also be a contributing mechanism to flow abundance relationships. Flow abundance relationships are really well documented in this estuary and are important for management, but some of the mechanisms behind them aren't as well understood. But we do know, for example, for longfin smelt, they prefer cooler water in general, and higher temperatures during droughts could be one of the reasons why they tend to do better in wet years. So the next steps for this, as I said, we really need further study to tease out the mechanisms and the causal basis behind this. It would be interesting to know whether cold water reservoir releases impact delta water temperatures. Many of the larger reservoirs have a way to release just the cold water at the bottom of the reservoir, generally to benefit salmonid spawning. But it's unknown whether that cold water release is still cold by the time it's the delta. It'd be interesting to know whether the atmospheric influences, like air temperature, are the primary drivers, and what the relative influences of those atmospheric versus inflow drivers. And lastly, what is the water cost of delta temperature management? So there is a causal link, which I think is likely, but again, we need to know to what extent there is a causal link. It'd be good to estimate the actual water cost of changing temperature by a degree that would. Right. So that was it for the temperature stuff. Now moving on to the biology. I talk about one last example of long-term trends in seasonality and abundance of 3 key zooplanktons in the upper San Francisco estuary. This was done in collaboration with Christina Birdie and Arthur from the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Rosemary Hartman from the Department of Water Resources. So zooplankton are a crucial link in the estuarine food web. They link primary producers to the consumers, like fishes. And fish are the species that are most regulated in this system. And we know a lot about a few zooplankton species. These are usually species thought to be important fish food. So there's the calanoid copepods, Pseudodiaptomys forbici and Eurytemera affinis, the cyclopoid Limnarothona tetraspina, and then the Cladoceran daphnia. But luckily, we have a really great long-term monitoring record for zooplankton in the estuary that makes it easier to study even more species than just those 4. So zooplankton have been monitored since 1972. And you can see all of the historical sampling sites in the map on the right from 5 different monitoring surveys. And they generally sampled some combination of 3 different size classes. There's a macrozooplankton net around 500 microns that samples amphipods and mysids. A mesozooplankton net around 150 microns that samples copepods and cladocerans. Then a microzooplankton net around 43 to 50 microns that samples smaller copepods and rotifers. And in this study, we decided to focus on 3 under species to try to expand our knowledge about more species in the system. First was Bosmina longirostrus, which is a small cladoceran that consumes phytoplankton, protists, and bacteria. And there's a Canthocyclops species, which is a cyclopoid copepod, and it's a species complex of 3 different species, but they're not differentiated in the monitoring programs. They're predators of other zooplankton as well as algae and cyanobacteria. Then we have Cardiella sinensis, which is a calanoid copepod that's a predator of other zooplankton and influences the distribution of Pseudodiaptomys forbici, one of the better studied species I mentioned earlier, the key component of delta smelt diets. All three of those species are found in. So the model that we used for this time it was a Bayesian generalized additive model. We used a log normal hurdle distribution. Hurdle models allow you to separately model whether something is present or absent with a binary distribution, and then their abundance if they are present. So that is one way to deal with zero inflation. If there's a lot of zeros in the data, separate out the zeros from the non-zeros. And the model, it actually, for the binary component, actually models the probability that they're absent. So in this case, we modeled that as a smooth function of salinity, since salinity is generally the biggest determinant of whether a zooplankton species is present or not. Then for the abundance component of the model, it was a smooth function of the day of year, the salinity, the year itself, and then a random intercept for station, which just let us account for any geographic effects that are unrelated to salinity. And the response variable is zooplankton catch per unit volume. There are too many results to show in this presentation, but I'm just going to show one of the key findings from each taxon. So first, for Bosmina longirostris, this figure, we have separate plots for different 5-year periods from 1975 to 2015. The x-axis is the day of the year, binned by month. Y-axis is their abundance, and then each line represents a different salinity bin, from purple, which is freshwater, up to brackish with the greenish color. And what we found is that Bosmina lost its fall abundance peak. So you notice in the earlier years, there's a clear spring and fall abundance peak for Bosmina that extended through at least 3 of the salinity bins. But by about 1995, that fall peak is. So now they only really peak in the spring. For Acanthocyclops, this graph is a little different. Now we have separate plots for each month, with year on the x-axis, again, separate lines for each salinity bin. And we found a striking decline in all months for Acanthocyclops. See a very clear decreasing trend. They seem to have a slight resurgence in some years during the summer, but generally they have greatly decreased in abundance from 1972 to present. And lastly, for Cardiella sinensis, again, separate plots for each month, but now we have salinity on the x-axis on a log scale, and the separate lines represent years, with the oldest year, 1995, in purple, and the most recent year, 2015, in the greenish color. And we found that their relationship with salinity has strengthened over time. And this is most apparent in the summer months, where you can see as you move from the purplish colors to the light green color, that the peak in the curve becomes much more pronounced. Why is this important? Of course, you need to understand fish food to understand fish. There have been a lot of declines in fish species abundance, some of which are thought to be due, at least in part, to declines in productivity and food availability. We also found that each zooplankton taxon has different abundance trends and relationships with environmental factors. So studying them in aggregate could vary the true patterns, and that's why it is important to look at the lowest taxonomic level that you can. And we really need a basic knowledge to guide monitoring and build food web models. We don't really have a good food web model in this estuary. There are efforts to try to improve that, but if that's going to be successful, we really need to have a basic understanding of the food species themselves. So just zooming out again, monitoring data are a critical tool for answering applied and basic questions. This is kind of how I think about the 3 studies I presented on the applied to basic continuum, with the inflow temperature study may be the most applied, the zooplankton the most basic, but implications for how they could be useful. And I'd encourage anyone to find some data and play with it. The Interagency Ecological Program has a great website that shows all their data. They've made great strides in making it as available and accessible as possible. And of course, open science helps everyone. It's been very helpful to me just in my own project. So, the temperature inflow study was really easy to conduct by just building off everything we'd done for the temperature change study. But also publishing your data more widely helps other scientists and can result in credit through data citations or data papers. These studies have been reliant on integrated databases and monitoring data for water quality, zooplankton, or fish. We also have interactive or Shiny apps to play with some of the data. So lastly, I'd just like to thank, of course, the monitoring survey staff, without whom we wouldn't have any data to analyze. So always appreciate their efforts. The Interagency Ecological Program for facilitating all of this monitoring, and the IP Climate Change Project Work Team, which was helpful in guiding the temperature. I have my contact email on the bottom if anyone would like to contact afterwards.
Thanks, Sam. So if you're on Zoom, please type questions in and I'll monitor for that. In the meantime, I'm going to look at the room for any questions for Sam. Sam, could ask Sam.
Thanks, Sam. That was a great talk. I am really curious about some of the trends you showed of increasing heat waves with air temperature. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the biological significance of air temperature, because I can imagine it might depend on season or on tides, or whether you're looking at a species that's more like intertidal or more subtidal. Thinking about the rocky shores and how air versus water affects some of the species you find there.
Yeah, that's a great question. In this study, since we were working mostly in the upper part of the estuary where it's brackish to freshwater, we weren't really focused on the intertidal zone. The air temperature component was actually mostly used for an assessment of impacts to human health. Our two collaborators from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment are epidemiologists who work on environmental epidemiology. So they were using some of those results to try to contextualize how heat waves affect people through direct mortality effects or indirect health effects or other. We're discussing a little bit impacts to terrestrial taxa, but most of the ecological component is more focused on the water temperatures, which are robust intertidal communities like you have here.
Thanks, Sam. I have a question. I know the models are not causative, but I still have to ask. So right back in the beginning, I don't know how far back, maybe you can go back, that's the first part where you showed clear warming during the warm blob period. Bar graph. Oh, there we are. Went past it.
I think it's that one?
No, it was go forward again, I believe. That probably shows there as well, yeah.
Wave one?
There, that one, yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
top right panel.
Yeah.
You know, the water heat wave, it's a heat wave occurrence, 14, 15, 16. I mean, that's pretty damn striking. And of course, not causative, but is that really a warm ocean water influencing the Delta Sassoon Bay? I guess it could also be flow related, and it could also be.
Yeah, I think there have been studies of the extent to which ocean temperatures influence water temperatures in the delta, and I think ocean temperatures might have some influence in Suisun Bay, but I think they don't really have much of an influence on water temperatures once you get into the freshwater delta. I mean, I think this is just an example of the hot droughts that I talked about, since these are both also drought periods. When we see these spikes in heat waves, relationship between air temperature and droughts themselves. Cause the warm blob also blocked the.
Yeah, so do the correlations. And well, that's kind of nice. Also, the Sacramento River, for example, is not going to be influenced by the ocean. Yeah, because in the ocean they found warming associated with the warm blob. To my mind, is like, is it really the warm blob warming it, or is it actually the warm drought warming it? And okay, other questions? Right today. I'm going to ask another one while you think of a good one. So I'm now going to ask you to speculate on the consequence side of things. So some notable changes in zooplankton there. Do you want to talk about what you think the impacts of any of those are, like on fish? Or...
Yeah, I mean, the zooplankton community is really interesting because it's had a huge amount of turnover in the last, as long as we've monitored it. There's been multiple waves of invasive species that have come in and kind of replaced the species that were there before. We don't actually know which, if any, of the species are native. That we used to think are native. Now people think, oh, actually they're not really native to here. Maybe they're from somewhere else. So like Pseudodioptimus forbici, the species I mentioned that's important in delta smelt diets, that's Southeast Asia. But I think a lot of the patterns we found are just indicative of that continual community turnover. Extent to which they impact fish diets is not entirely clear. I mean, one problem is there's some monitoring of fish diets, but it's not a comprehensive, consistent, like a sample fish diets as needed, or as special studies come on board, but there's not a consistent diets over time, which makes it a little bit hard to find out what the impact of specific species is. Diets of the fish, but generally any change like that is concerning, especially if you're losing an abundant species. Losing that fall abundance fall period when with other challenging conditions, that's when inflow can be.
Yep, it's a complex system for sure.
Hi, Sam. Thank you. Just like what you were just saying, it's probably a little more difficult to gastric lavage a delta smelt than it is a striped bass. So those fish diet monitoring programs, I used to work on a few more opportunities. Going back towards the Zoop presentation, I was really interested to see that decline in Acanthocyclops. Would you mind flipping back to those slides? So if I understood correctly, this is more correlation and less causation. Do you, and this is just conjecture, but what do you think is also contributing to Acanthocyclops decline in the system? I mean, that in addition to, I think it is one of those predatory zoops in the system. So I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there have been a few big changes. So in the late 1980s, there was the invasion of an invasive that greatly reduced productivity in the region and led to a lot of food web changes that could have been a contributor, although you see most of the decline is actually before that happened. Another thought we had is that it could be due to the facilitation of a common predator by another invasive species, Limnorhynchus, small cyclopoid that became very abundant after they invaded. Cardiella sinensis, the next species we studied, is a larger predatory copepod. So if they are facilitated by the invasion of another species, it could have increased their ability to predate on Acanthocyclops. The thing that's really tricky with zooplankton is very difficult to identify competition among zooplankton species. There are very few studies that have done that. Mostly people might suggest that competition is a cause for something, but it's really hard to evaluate the extent to which competition is really occurring or not. That could be a cause because we have these waves of species that have invaded and then communities that have turned over in conjunction with that. So maybe there's competition going on, but it's really hard to narrow down whether that's or if it's something else like facilitation of predator or just declines in overall productivity. That's a great question.
So going forward, you discussed that you want to tease apart the impacts that cloud cover has on the region. How would you go about kind of teasing the inflow from the cloud cover? What would be your next steps to go forward with that?
From sorry, were you saying cloud
to
cover?
Understand the impacts that cloud cover during the months of March and April have on the region.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to maybe zoom in a little more than we did and look at more temporally frequent data. So the data we used are from monitoring programs that go out maybe weekly, but usually more at the monthly basis. So it could be interesting to look at, say, a continuous monitoring station that's collecting data, pair that up with cloud cover information to look at a higher temporal frequency, what the relationship is between water temperature and cloud cover would be one way. How that changes seasonally as the days get longer. I think ultimately what we really need is a mechanistic model of water temperatures in the region, which there have been some attempts to do in the past, but they're really computationally intensive. So prior study did, I think they only ran it for one, just because of the computational power to do it. And so that prior study is Vroom et al. 2017. They had cloud cover in their model. So they assessed, just broadly what is the influence of humidity, air temperature, cloud cover. I can't remember though. Maybe it's just solar radiation. I think that would probably be the best way of doing it, but there's computational limits to what you can really model. I mean, I'd like to see a full time series for those models, but they often can only run them.
Sam, here's a question from Helen, who really wanted to show that photo of you in your crab outfit. That's why she wanted to introduce you. I didn't have it. You're lucky. Or maybe. Thanks for such a great talk, Sam. Perhaps I missed this, but when you presented temperature trends in the estuary, did you notice changes in temperature variability through time as well? If so, what do you think may be causing such change?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's not something that we looked at hard. I think probably the data set we used wouldn't be the best to do that, since it was at a monthly time step. I'd imagine it'd be better to look at the continuous monitoring record more closely at variability. The reason we use discrete data from boat-based surveys is just because there's a longer record of that monitoring over a greater spatial area, whereas the continuous stations usually only have about 20 years of data for those, and it's harder to assess long-term temperature trends from 20 years, but yeah, that would definitely be something interesting.
Great. There's also a question from Erin. Remember her? Thanks, Erin. Sam, thanks for a great talk. What are you most excited about looking forward in the context of open data science and California state agency work? Specifically, what are some tools or other approaches you may not yet be using but seem promising?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think the biggest thing that's really exciting is just making more data open and more available and better documented. I think it's been a very recent change, even over the years that I've been working since I left here. That will always help things out. In terms of more like upcoming tools, not sure. I think there's a lot of great tools right now that I've used. Don't do as much open science or data science work in my current position.
Yeah, I would punt that as well. That's a huge question.
Maybe
No
Aaron
worries.
can tell us.
We also have another question from Lauren Ashlock. Also says, great talk. I'm interested, which it is. I really enjoyed it. I'm interested in the zooplankton abundance data. Do you have any thoughts about what caused these trends through time? Do you think temperature or predators play a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely predators could play a role, as I mentioned. And temperature is interesting. There are theories that warming temperatures will lead to smaller taxa, across trophic levels. It'll, at multiple levels of organization too, that warming temperatures would lead to smaller body sizes within a species, across species, within a community. We're kind of seeing that in this system with the invasion of more smaller bodied copepods that are becoming more abundant. So there's potential that temperature could be a driver of that. But the extent to which it's driven the patterns in any particular species.
Determined. Yeah. I think there's one more question and then we'll let you go. This person is anonymous, so we don't know who they are. What might cause a zooplankton species to strengthen its relationship with salinity? What might drive a trend like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think some examples from the past are where biotic influences constrain the abiotic niche that a species can occupy. That's what was found with Pseudodaptinus forbici, where Acardiolus sinensis invaded. They kind of constrained the region that Pseudodaptinus could occupy because they predated on them so much in the most abundant. That's a very likely driver. Otherwise, yeah, it's not really clear. Probably biological influences.
Yeah, I think we all probably, I feel like it's just me, but probably all of us tend to think very linear way, right? Change in temperature, change in zooplankton, change in fish. It's just a straight, non-complex system. But lots to think about, and thanks for the talk, but also doing all this work. Really interesting. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks.